finally beginning to see some pushback at the federal and state level against those who would suppress free speech on college campuses. Next on the Campus Roundup. Hello, I'm Dr. Duke, and this is the Campus Roundup at the College Fix. This week we're looking at President Trump's new campus free speech executive order and the impact it may or may not have on campus freedom of speech. To talk more about this, we welcome College Fix staff reporter Graham Pirro. Graham, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Graham, you've written a number of really coherent, interesting articles about the free speech issue on college campuses. Take a moment and just, in your words, tell us what you see the current state of free speech and the First Amendment on college campuses. Where are we?
Sure. So an interesting shift that's been going on for a couple of years has been states passing legislation to try to essentially mandate intellectual diversity and free speech on campus. This really started officially in 2017 when Colorado and one other state, I believe it was Tennessee, also passed a legislation that basically protected the rights of students to speech on campus. This usually took the form of establishing outdoor zones as free speech areas, and also ensuring that campus administrations can't charge overly significant fees for speakers that students invite. Now, this started in 2017. President Trump's executive order sort of brought it more into the limelight. But we've seen other states this year, such as Texas, also Kentucky, Iowa, are also among states that have been taking action to protect speech on campus. So it appears right now that states aren't necessarily trying to preempt President Trump's executive order because of the fact that many of these legislative pushes started before the order was established. But what we're seeing right now is local governments and now the federal government paying more attention to this speech issue and trying essentially to legislate intellectual diversity and free speech, which is a question in and of itself as to whether or not they can effectively do this.
Well, let me play devil's advocate with you. As a professor myself, who is currently under investigation because of speech and who has seen what goes on a relatively off-center campus, it's not one of the main campuses, at a relatively small branch campus university in Wisconsin, I've seen what's happening to free speech. I've hosted now over 53 episodes of this show, and over and over again, we keep talking about how universities are doubling down, it seems, on the suppression of speech. So the good news is, like you say, state legislatures are trying to take the bull by the horns. Why do you think, or do you agree, that it does seem as if the universities are getting farther left on this? And what can be done about that over and above the occasional state legislature trying to regulate a little bit?
Sure. So this was an idea actually that came from the National Association of Scholars, who have been really pushing on this issue. They released a plan that would essentially punish universities that are not deemed to be supporting speech by depriving them of federal student aid, which is a fairly radical and can be seen as sort of an approach that takes a more of an approach that wants to punish universities for not supporting free speech. But there's also the question of how do you enforce speech on campus? This is a big question that a lot of the legislation that has been passed has been facing, because for the most part, in terms of enforcement mechanisms, they simply require a report from the university as to how that university has been fostering intellectual diversity on campus. But beyond that, it's not 100% clear how these universities would be held accountable. And there's also the fact that this legislation, for the most part, has applied to public universities. Private universities obviously are not affected by this legislation that affects public universities.
Well, I agree with you 100%. It does seem to me that universities care as much about money as they do ideology, and so to hit them in that corner would perhaps make them rethink a little bit. But in all your research that you've done for The Fix and in researching all of these wonderful articles, why do you think it is that universities are so hesitant to defend the rights of speech in many cases, and why are these calls from the National Association of Scholars and Donald Trump's executive order, why are they necessary? What's going on in college campuses that makes administrators side with those who would silence speech?
So one thing that I found interesting in researching these articles is that a lot of the time it's difficult to sort of break down the issue of free speech on a left-right divide. Now, generally, we hear about high-profile instances of right-wing speakers being disinvited or protests occurring on campus, or even straight-up violence occurring on campus because of radical figures being invited to speak. But a lot of the time, it cuts both ways. Sometimes religious universities are reluctant to take on speakers who are on the left of issues. So it's difficult to pigeonhole things on a left-right axis. What I found as a principal conclusion is that generally universities just want to avoid controversy. They want to avoid bad press. They want to avoid the press that would happen if a student protest occurred or if a speaker were to be disinvited. So it's not necessarily about a left-right axis, which I think it gets reduced to a lot. I think it's more that universities just don't want to deal with controversy. They don't want bad press. They instead just want to, for the most part, have speakers that are pretty blasé or mainstream or won't spark a reaction among conservatives or liberal students. So generally, I think it's an aversion to controversy, which is understandable on the part of the university. But at the same time, it's important that we hold these universities accountable and ensure that they're not suppressing the speech rights of their students or the rights of their students to invite various speakers in favor of simply avoiding controversy.
Now, one of the things you've done is you've looked at the Donald Trump plan carefully. You saw what the NAS put forth. I know you've studied South Dakota, Texas, some of these other states that have been Colorado. Having seen all of the different proposals, just pick your brain a little bit. Having looked at the broad scope of this, what do you think would be the most effective ways over and above what you've seen so far? What else can we do to try to guarantee everybody's free speech rights on college campuses?
So I think that right now, encouraging states to take action on their own is probably the best course, simply because depriving universities of federal financial aid or research funds, that seems to me to be overly punishing, and also could harm students. So I think that is an overly harsh approach, and instead leaving it to state legislatures who generally know their states the best, and also pre-existing relationships with Board of Regents in states. For example, when I was researching the series of articles I wrote about South Dakota and its push for intellectual diversity on campus, understanding the relationship between the Board of Regents and the local government in that state was extremely important in understanding the ways that this legislation would affect the relationship between the Board of Regents and the state legislature. So I think as of right now, leaving it to states to determine the best way to proceed is probably the safest and also the most, maybe not cautious, but the best way to sort of run a couple of trial runs and see whether or not this legislation that has been passed is actually effective. Now, it is worth noting that really, with the exception of Colorado, most of the states that have passed this legislation about free speech are generally deep red states, or they're Republican trifectas, which means that the Republican Party controls both houses of the legislature and the governor's seat. So whether or not this will simply be reduced to deep red states passing this legislation while blue states not making it a legislative priority remains to be seen. In which case, if we were to simply continue to encourage these states to take action, it could be reduced to red state versus blue state. But I think as of right now, it's best to be cautious and make sure that we're still having these conversations, but also not being overly punishing to universities.
Graham Pirro, thank you so much for your time today. Wish you the best of luck as you head off a new position at the Washington Free Beacon. Best of luck. I look forward to reading you there. And thanks for joining us today.
Thanks a ton, Duke. I appreciate it.
Be sure to stay up on all the latest news and information from the College Fix by joining us on all of our social media platforms. For the Campus Roundup, I'm Dr. Duke, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.